Hi, welcome back to the show. My guest today is Jonathan Fugelsang. He's a professor and researcher on the psychology of higher level cognition at the University of Waterloo. Thinking critically of the world is hard, and it takes a lot of work, especially in a world where new information is bombarding you at every turn. How can we sort truth from fiction and the profound from pseudo-profound bullshit? Expect to learn why the quote, attention and intention are the mechanics of manifestation doesn't really mean anything. Why both simple and highly intelligent people are more prone to become polarized. Why you think you may see faces in the sky. Why the most confident people often know the least. And much more. Don't forget, you may be watching but not subscribed. And that means you may miss future videos. I don't want that. You don't want that. So let's fix it. If you're watching on YouTube, click the red subscribe button below. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, go to the podcast homepage and hit the plus follow button. Thanks for your support. But now, ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Fugelsang. American philosopher Harry Frankfurt made the distinction between bullshit and lying when he said, "It is impossible for someone to lie unless he thinks he knows the truth. Producing bullshit requires no such convictions." Right. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, so that's I think that kind of hits the nail on the head, and basically it kind of was sparked our whole line of work in this area. Basically, that really what we're looking at here is something that is different than lying in and of itself. Although they do share a lot of properties, but they're not exactly the same thing.
Gotcha. And the eye-catching headline that the media kind of took and ran with and wrote a bunch of articles and such on, the title of it was, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it is "On the Reception and Detection of Pseudo-Profound Bullshit."
Exactly. Yeah, and that was really the brainchild of my former graduate student Gordon Pennycook, who I remember when he kind of was kind of brought this idea to myself and my colleague Derek Kohler. We weren't too sure about what we weren't kind of too sure about what this whole research direction was all about, and we we're probably a little bit nervous and apprehensive. But we trusted Gordon, and which has always been kind of a good practice on our part, as he always knew what he was doing, and it really did take off as a line of work.
Good on you, Gordon. You got the eye for the marketing side. Very nice.
He really does, and he's kind of taken off as well too, like in the whole fake news area as well too. Like he kind of. He's got an eye for what research is I don't know is interesting and tractable as well too.
Yeah, in vogue I think comes to mind.
Exactly.
And I do want to touch on social media and fake news and all that stuff later. But before we get there, for people who aren't familiar with the work behind the title, can you give some explanation as to what the research is looking at? What you guys are studying, things along those lines, just so people are kind of caught up.
Yeah. So basically, in that original line of work, what we were kind of interested in is what is essentially called the pseudo-profound bullshit, which is essentially people kind of stringing together vacuous, kind of big, smart-sounding, low-frequency words, stringing them.
Do you have any top-of-mind examples, just so people can kind of root that?
I wished I had the paper right beside me right now to actually have. I could read off some quotes, and my students would know this much better than I. They could actually kind of string a bunch together, and I actually can't think of.
It's quite all right. I think one that comes to mind, and I was thinking about this because you guys essentially, and I will let you explain and correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a section of research where you used some website to generate phrases that sounded profound,
Yeah.
which is just really an amalgamation of random words. And then you also compared that to this world of online gurus, and I believe it's Deepak Chopra, something like that.
That's right. So he was kind of, and I think that was a lot of the motivation to, with Gordon wanting to go down, my student wanting to go down this route, is he kind of looked at these kind of, some self-help gurus out there, and some of the things that they were saying, and he was thinking to himself, there's nothing, there's no real meat to this. There's
one example, sorry, just to interrupt here. I think one example, just to root it in something, it was something along the lines of attention and intention are the yes. Please, just, if you want to just run with that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
Attention and intention are something the tools of manifestation, something like that.
And exactly. I can't think of exactly what that phrase was right now, but that was. And looking through, and actually in our paper too, we actually used some of his quotes, his actual quotes, as well as the ones that were just randomly generated. Got you.
And what you guys are looking at when you give these quotes or these phrases to participants, to people who you're studying, what are you looking for?
What we're basically interested in there is like the whole idea is kind of from an individual differences perspective. Is who's most susceptible to this type of information was what our main interest was at the time. Is somebody because if you kind of if you say you can sound like you're saying something extremely deep and meaningful, and if there's nothing there, who's going to basically kind of fall for this sort of thing?
Right. So then I guess that begs the question. After you guys have collected this large pool of data after running these studies, what are some of the groups or distinctions that you found? So who is maybe on the more openness, believable side of the spectrum versus who is a lot more spectacle? That's not the right one. Suspicious of these pseudo-profound bullshit phrases.
Yeah, and so one of the biggest things that we found was its association to something called reflection or cognitive reflection. And those that are more likely to just basically, and it sounds kind of silly just saying that, those that are people that are more likely to slow down and think, that are actually, and are less likely to go with their intuitions, are going to be the ones that find that information less profound, that are more likely to see through it.
And are there other factors when you consider that? So, or is that just kind of spill down? So one example that I was thinking of is if you look at political leaning. So people who identify as being on the left are likely to be more open-minded, more willing to accept new ideas and people, et cetera. Whereas people on the right, or people who are more conservative, would tend to be more religious, which might also fall in the same bucket. So I don't know if you've found any other lines of distinction
right now, and I don't know if we've actually, or if any has looked at political orientation. There are, susceptibility to pseudo-profound bullshit does track with those things that you think it would track. It does track with things like conspiratorial thinking, religiosity, a lot of that stuff. It does track with those sorts of things. It does track as well too with even measures of cognitive ability as well too.
So people who are more conspiratorially leaning or religious are more likely to be Deepak Chopra fans.
Yeah, it would also be more likely to rate the pseudo-profound as being profound.
Interesting.
We also did some work kind of led by my student Alexander Walker and Martin Turpin. We looked at some work even relating that to what's called illusory pattern perception, which is you're more likely to actually see patterns in things that don't exist. If you look at like basically seeing things in clouds or seeing patterns. We didn't actually use clouds in this example, but just actually seeing what there's called a snowy dot pictures task. I can't remember what the actual name of the task was. snowy dots task of some way. So you basically, it looks like, a TV set when it's just fuzzy, but there are patterns in some and not patterns in others. People that are susceptible to this pseudo-profound bullshit are also more likely to see images when no such images exist.
Oh, wow. There are so many runaway implications with that, especially when you start looking at social media.
That's actually one of my favorite kind of studies that we've done over the years. It's just kind of just seeing things like actually in pictures that don't, in images that don't exist. You're more likely to see those things. That is associated with a similar kind of susceptibility to information.
So why is this the case? So we've touched on that cognitive ability is one of the driving factors for people finding perhaps meaning where there is none. But I'm just trying to think, like, evolutionarily speaking, or through an evolutionary psychology lens, is there any theories or explanations? Or have you guys really gone in that domain at all?
That's a good question, and I don't think I have a good answer for you. I'm not too sure what the actual benefit is. Here's one thing, and this is kind of humans seem this, and this kind of goes based back on work from a former mentor of mine, Mike Gazzaniga, who did a lot of work with split brain patients years ago. And he basically, one of his theories that he came up with is that humans have this unique kind of capacity to find meaning in things. So we basically, humans don't like the idea of randomness. We basically like to think that there's like a causal explanation for everything. And even if there isn't one, we'll find one. And so he had this, part of his theory was called this left hemisphere interpreter, which was basically this idea that we are basically trying to make sense of the world. And it's kind of, potentially a uniquely human attribute. And that actually can help us in some ways, where we're basically always trying to find patterns in things, seek explanations, not basically kind of accept the fact that sometimes there's nothing there. We like meaning. And we find our brains are very good at extracting meaning from information. But I think it just basically might have a byproduct of just being a bit overactive sometimes.
Yeah.
Where maybe one of the faults of this is that we kind of overinterpret, find things sometimes when there's nothing there. And that's kind of, you can see why that, like, where superstitions come from. Conspiracy theories come, the idea is like you're trying to, there's got to be a simple explanation for this, or these and you kind of come up with kind of stories for basically why things happen.
That really made me think of Yuval Noah Harari, the guy who wrote *Sapiens*, which is this very, very popular book. I don't know if you're familiar, but he basically recounts the history of humanity, and one thing that he really touches on strongly is the ability for humans to rally around shared beliefs or ideas, and this begins with religion. So the fact that maybe people find meaning in things that aren't really there might just be a bit of a hangover from our earlier days, where things like that would solicit stronger connections, tighter knit social circles, things like that, which is very interesting to consider.
Yeah, and it's interesting how all a lot of these things kind of hang together. They're correlated when if you put them together in a study. They all those sorts of things hang together, and there might be some like that kind of might be something to that idea.
Yeah, I was speaking with Jeff Orchard, who's a colleague of yours at Waterloo, and he was even saying
theoretical for neuroscience.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Jeff was a real treat. One thing that we did talk about is the reason, or one of the leading theories for the reasons why our brains are as large as they are, is to hold many social connections in our brains at the same time. So again, it's not what do I think of you, Jonathan, and what does my roommate think of me, but it's like, okay, do you know my roommate, and what do you think of my roommate? So I know how to act with my roommate, so I don't get caught in spreading lies or gossip or whatever. So we're very socially wired, and that to me sounds like that could be a very strong reason for trying to find meaning in things that aren't necessarily always there.
Yeah, well, we always read, and this again, this is so like I'm not a social psychologist, and so it's completely beyond what I know and understand. But it seems like that that drive, for belongingness, for groups, for all that, like it probably drives a lot of our behaviors. And how our minds are wired. That totally makes sense to me.
Yeah. So even now, I work at a larger company that handles a lot of data, and whenever I want to get something done in my job, in my position, generally speaking, if you don't come to the table with data, it's hard to agree to do something. However, on the opposite end of things, if I were to give a presentation where I just give charts and slides and numbers, that's going to be almost equally ineffective at soliciting the support of my colleagues to do a certain thing. And this is something that I haven't really considered up until this past year, is that stories are a lot more powerful than numbers and data when you aggregate that out across the masses. Sure, if you're talking to people who are in hard sciences, who are very analytically minded, they might favor, a 10 slide deck with just numbers and slides and this and that. So is there any, again, theory as to why this may be the case? Is like, why are stories so compelling?
Yeah. And it's just, but I think you're touching on a good point. Like how the narrative is so important. And we are, and it's a problem, I think, with science in general, is that you can give anybody a graph or anybody a piece of data, and you can tell a story in multiple different ways based on, a single pattern of data. And I think, and that's, again, it's one of our kind of unique human traits, where we have this uncanny ability to find meaning in things, and to tell stories about things.
Absolutely. And like if you even consider one data point, okay, you might be able to sway that, but that might be a little harder to do. But once you start adding, 4, 5, 10, 20 data points, well, the interactions between all of those can be much more complex, and one person can see one thing and one person can maybe see another. And
100%. Yeah.
Perhaps it's just a screen with the snow cloud dots, as you were saying.
Exactly. But what we won't see is we won't see nothing. Like that's like, well, always, like, I think it's like the tendency is to find something there. Randomness doesn't sit well with us. It's one of those things where you do really kind of, and we do that as scientists. When we're looking at data, we're basically looking at a pattern of data, and we want to kind of like find a nice simple story that explains that pattern of data.
I guess just taking a step back. So again, talking about the people who are more susceptible to this, one of the most common ways to classify people in terms of their personality is it's the big five. It's Ocean. So it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So as I kind of touched on earlier, I would imagine that people who are more prone to openness would be more likely to fall and be susceptible to bullshit. But I don't know if you have any corrections to make there, or if that expands beyond just openness to the other big five.
You know what? I don't know if I don't know of any work that's looked at that specifically. It's because it's weird, because openness, and the only thing I'm familiar with the idea of openness is actively open-minded thinking, which kind of is a different sort of thing, where it's basically one's willingness to change their beliefs according to evidence, which has kind of a different feel, I think, anyways, to the openness in terms of the big five.
I see. Yeah, that seems almost counter to what I was thinking.
It seems all, and it's kind of like it's a different, exactly. I think it's kind of the flip of what, and of what of the openness that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's so interesting just how malleable we think we are in terms of changing our opinions versus how set in our ways we become based on things that happen in our developing years. I was just listening to a podcast this morning, actually, where there was a lady talking about the differences between the different generations of Americans. So boomers to, I believe the newest is alpha or whatever, which is 2013
Yeah,
and beyond
I
or something
can't
like
keep track of all the generations. I don't even know what generation I am.
Yeah. The point being, there was a section where they talk about political leaning, like are young people becoming more democratic, more open, more progressive? And there's generally always a trend that way. But one thing that really struck me was she said there is a bit of a critical period based on your upbringing where depending on who the sitting president is and based on their popularity, that can skew you one way or the other for your entire life. So
Interesting.
Because you always like to believe that, oh yes, like I would love to, like I have the ability to change my mind based on new information that's counter to my existing beliefs. But I think it's really hard to understand the base level when there's so many of these factors that are just compounding over time.
It's really complicated, and that's where, like even like there are so many different variables at work here, and like even there's like I talked about before, this idea of cognitive reflection being a good thing when one's willingness to think, and that is often associated with one's willingness to change their beliefs in the face of evidence. If you're willing to think, then you're also sometimes more willing to kind of be open to modify your beliefs in terms of new evidence. But it can also work the opposite way. It can also, there's this thing called, motivated reasoning as well too, where you can put that thinking effort in to actually more polarize what your beliefs are. Because then you can basically sit there and rationalize something and basically to turn it into something consistent with what you already believe.
Interesting. So it's a bit of a U-shaped curve, right? Like as you become more conscientious and open to new information, then your ability to change your mind increases. But then as you keep going along that spectrum,
it could very well kind of work, counterproductively in terms of reinforcing what your beliefs are.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never considered that. It's also very interesting to consider that again. Oh, sorry. Please go on.
And that's okay. And what I was going to say, and again, and this is, I'm always anxious. Like I emailed you before. I'm always worried about going too far outside my lane, which I have a very narrow lane. But it is one of those. It's one of those really interesting kind of ideas when you look at like partisan views, and there's like, when you have extremely different partisan views, but you have highly intelligent, highly reflective people on both sides. It's not that just, it's easy coming from one side and saying, well, that group, they're just not thinking.
Exactly. Yes. It's almost like when you want to consider the idea of tribes, like I think that word gets thrown out a lot. Like people today are more tribal than ever, which I don't know if that's true or not. But when I always considered that, I thought of people who would be tribal to be people who are maybe not so open to information, not so intelligent.
You think vulnerable. You think open to, like potentially open to
drinking the Kool-Aid,
to all those things. But it's sure that's there. Like those groups of people, those individuals are there, but it's also made up of large groups of people that are not that are high, that are highly open-minded in terms of thinking, that are highly reflective, that are all those things.
Just because they're able to take in all this information, they seek the information, they want to get all the data points to maximize their beliefs. But really, what that does is just allow them to categorize and bin everything to then support their underlying beliefs.
To support their own beliefs, exactly. And
wow.
And the other thing about this as well too is even when we talk about things like when I mentioned actively open-minded thinking, which is a measure and scale I love, that it's been talked about for years. I think Jonathan Barron was the first one to talk about it, but then people like Toplick and Stanovich and others kind of refined scales over the years, but it depends as well so much on what those beliefs are. Some beliefs are very malleable, versus others, you hold close to your heart kind of thinking, and no matter what evidence might be out there, you're not going to change those things.
To do the self-reflection, the introspection, to really do the work of analyzing what you think, what you stand for, what you believe in, who you want to be, that's hard work. I don't think a lot of people necessarily want to do that all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what this whole kind of, when I was talking a little bit about one's willingness to reflect, and one's willingness to think, there's a huge, there's a number of scales out there that capture that. Like one of them, like need for cognition is one scale. And that's just that basic idea, like how much do you like to think? how much do you kind of want to put the effort in to think? And people vary a lot on that. Some people are quite happy not engaging the mental effort to contemplate things.
Oh, sometimes I wish. Sometimes I
know,
can only wish.
Yeah, the world would be a lot sad if you just it'd be like a very satisfying place.
Yeah, if you could just hit a button, be like, you know what, this one, I'm out. I'm out of
it. I don't. This one is like, yeah, that's a tough issue. I'm just gonna check out.
Yeah. I think we could all do a better job at doing that. Maybe not. So you mentioned these scales for critical thinking, one of them being your propensity to think, your enjoyment in thinking. And I think perhaps the best example of that is the philosopher who spends his days reading and writing and reflecting and analyzing everything. Can you touch on some of the other scales?
Yeah, so there's a number of them, and I mentioned, so actively open-minded thinking is a big one, and it's kind of one of my favorites because I think it's quite useful. I'm trying to think of this rational experiential inventory as well too.
What is that?
There's a number of scales that have come out that are really contrasting. One's basically like contrasting one's willingness to be analytic versus one's reliance on analytic thinking versus one's relying on intuitions. So it kind of Danny Kahneman in his Thinking Fast and Slow book, it's kind of basically popularized a lot of this work. Basically, how you can kind of split thinking in two ways. In psychology, we like dichotomies. We probably overuse dichotomies a fair bit, but just the idea that do we like to go with our gut or our heart, or do we like to think analytically about things? And so there's kind of a number of these scales that capture those kind of aspects in different ways. One's willingness to put the analytic thinking, the hard work in, or one's reliance on their intuitions or their guts. So one of my my colleagues, my former PhD supervisor, Valerie Thompson, she kind of looks at both these things at the same time in a variety of tasks, where what she does is she gets people to, solve a bunch of problems and gets them to first answer as quickly as they can under a response deadline, and then gives them time to reflect and think more about the problem. And so, and this kind of split between these two things, it basically captures quite a bit, I think, of how we actually make our decisions. There's lots of analogies out there that people have used, about the different role between intuitions and analytic thinking, and how much of our decisions are driven by our intuitions. Like, I'm going to get these analogies completely wrong, but I'll like, some people kind of talk about it like, is it the difference between like a tail wagging the dog kind of thing? Is the dog, is that our analytic mind, or is the dog, and the dog basically the intuitive beast that's kind of driving our thinking, similar to like the idea of a jockey isn't the right word, but the person driving an elephant, like it's like, is that basically what our intuitions are? Is that kind of the extent of what our intuitions are driving our behavior? And our analytic mind is just like that, the little person on top trying to steer and control this massive beast underneath us.
I see.
And
I think that's
so
a great analogy.
Yeah, so there are a couple of those analogies which I completely butchered, I'm sure. But this is all in the spirit of good fun anyways. So,
absolutely. I think that went very well, Jonathan. Don't sweat that.
But there's a lot, even people that are highly analytic, intuitions are still driving a lot of the decisions that we make on a daily basis.
Likely more than they would want to admit if they had to really sit and look at it.
Exactly, yeah. And it's like thinking with your heart versus thinking with your brain.
So you mentioned Thinking Fast and Slow, and that's a book that's been recommended to me multiple times, and I really want to read it because I believe that's like, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner, I believe.
Nobel Prize
winner.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Daniel Kahneman.
Doesn't get bigger than that. Yeah, so he won the Nobel Prize in economics. I can't remember what year that was, but for his, like, him and Amos Tversky have they have decades of work basically demonstrating all these kind of intuitions over the years that have driven that drive much of what our thinking is.
So I haven't come across that one to really analyze what Daniel's saying in that piece. What I have read, which I guess is a bit more of the kind of Netflix version, would be Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, which is, I guess, a little bit similar in thought. I guess the argument there is
like basically the idea, I think, with Gladwell's book, and like basically the idea of like making a lot of judgments based on very minimal information, I think.
Which I think has been kind of memed on a lot. I think people are they happily have not. I think that he opens with a tale, with a story of somebody who's deep in the historical art world, and he's coming in to judge a statue that's been recovered, and this museum just paid an ungodly amount of money for it because they believe that it was authentic. And within a split second, the person knew that it was a fake. And then he goes through this entire book trying to outline kind of why that may be, et cetera, et cetera. But it is kind of interesting just to see that juxtaposition. I guess that is really much so highlighting or punctuating the difference between analytical thinkers and intuitive thinkers.
But I think in that example that you're talking about there, it's like intuitions, we have them for a reason. Like it's not all bad. It can be like anything. You do something enough and it can become quite automatized. Like playing a musical instrument, like you can't, like Stevie Ray Vaughan didn't think about where, like after he was playing, he didn't think about where his fingers were going on the fretboard. He could actually, it was so ingrained, it would happen automatically. And a lot of things that we do, just like that example you talk about, you can get it in an instant. Like, like you think of somebody you're looking at, like, a fake Rolex. An expert can pick up that watch, tell you in a second that, no, this is a fake.
Something's wrong. Maybe the weight is off by a few grams and they can tell because they've handled it.
And then it takes them a second when somebody asks, well, why? Well, then they can unpack it for you once they start looking around and see some of the things that are off with it. But they get that initial gut, can tell what's there's something off with it.
That's fascinating. So one of my questions that I wanted to ask you was if there is a difference between, or not a difference rather, but if there is a ratio of people who are typically intuitive thinkers versus analytical thinkers. But perhaps that's the wrong question. Maybe it's more so, what is the domain of expertise? Because once you're an expert in a domain, you may skew towards more so intuitive thinking, like the Rolex expert.
That's a really good question. And like oftentimes when we look at this stuff, we're not looking at it in terms, and I'm thinking of other researchers who've been looking at intuitive thinking versus analytic thinkers. Oftentimes it's not looked at within the domain of what their expertise is. So typically, and this is painting with a very broad, brush here, is typically like the intuitive thinking is kind of thought of as a negative thing, versus the analytic thinking, that propensity is more of a positive thing. And it correlates with performance on like kind of reasoning decision type tasks. But I can imagine like in certain domains, intuitive thinking is a benefit where you can make, because it saves you time. If you thought analytically and deeply about every decision that you had to make, it would slow you down a lot. Versus this, this would kind of like being able to rely on your intuitions, which have been finely tuned throughout your lifetime. Like you are based on your experiences. Being able to rely on those intuitions does save you a whole lot of cognitive effort.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind is when I was in first year, I was actually in physics before I switched into engineering. And at the beginning of the year in physics, I think 121, the mechanics first year course, you begin and the problems are quite easy and then they ramp up very quickly. But by the end of the semester, things that were once not so intuitive are now just, oh yeah, it's this, like factor in parabolic motion or parabolic motion, et cetera. Whereas before that was a cognitive burden, and now you've almost freed yourself of that because now you're just leaning on.
And then your brain can do other things. Exactly. And so like moving things from the control to the automatic frees your mind so that you can do other things. Like so think about driving a car. And I know we don't have many manual transmissions around these days, but or riding a bike. But you think about the amount, like if you ever drove a manual transmission, the amount of energy you had to kind of exert at first and thinking about where to put the shifters and how to kind of coordinate with the clutch and the brake and the gas and all that kind of stuff. That devotes a lot of attention, and you can't really listen to music at the same time because that's just going to be too much. But after time, that you no longer have to divert that conscious attentional resources to that, to that task anymore. And it frees you up to actually be able to, drive with your arm out the window, listen to music and all that other sort of thing. But it's the same thing with when you're talking about when you're learning physics. There's actually a fair bit of research out there on, actually physics is kind of a domain that people have studied with expertise, and how people like novices versus experts see problems differently.
That's one of my favorite thought patterns ever, is education and practice literally changes the way that you see the world.
It does. It really does. And it actually, and you just kind of see, like, so with the physics problem, you'll basically be able to see the theme, see the kind of the problem in terms of its principles, rather than a novice who's just kind of stuck at the superficial details of the problem and trying to kind of figure out what the problem is.
Exactly. I think one thing that really highlights this is when I was in high school and I was learning about basic physics, I think I had a temporary job at a grocery store. So I was racking shopping carts, and it was winter, it was cold, and we got some freezing rain or something. So I was able to push the cart, and I didn't just see the cart rolling across the parking lot. I saw the coefficient of friction dropping, and then I saw the inelastic collision. It's been a while, folks. The inelastic collision with another cart, and seeing that the energy transfer, and I could actually see the forces. And maybe this sounds like a little autistic or something, I don't know, but it's a way of applying mental models.
Yeah, And there is work, and this is an area I know nothing about, but I'll just say the word. Is essentially there's a whole area of research. Sue Carey at Harvard, I think, is one of the people who's most well known for this one, called conceptual change, and it's like she's a developmental psychologist who's done a lot of work looking at this over the years, and basically just trying to map out and model how it is that people can have these, rapid shifts and how they perceive things in the world. But I think physics is a great example of that, because people have looked at kind of those, more impetus ideas of physics, like basically the idea that if a ball kind of goes, they think that it's going to continue to go circular once it exits the tube, versus somebody that understands, physics knows it's just going to go straight.
Yeah.
But those sorts of problems have been studied quite a bit in this idea of what it takes for that to become the more intuitive idea about how the world works.
We touched on just then a little bit about being overburdened with analytical props or proses in your environment until you can understand how to act in the world. And perhaps this is something that you develop as a very young kid. You learn how to walk, and now you don't need to think about walking. You just do it.
Right.
Things like that.
Like riding a bike. Exactly. Like that whole, there's lots of examples of that. Yeah.
So my thought is, we live in a world where our attention is being grabbed and pulled in every which direction, and we have more choice than ever. Again, another book that I just read that I'm totally in love with the concepts is Barry Schwartz's A Paradox of Choice.
Okay. I've heard of it. I haven't read it, but I've heard. Yeah, it's
fantastic. You would really enjoy it. I recommend that you pick it up. Basically, he outlines that in a world of free markets, there's always going to be somebody who applies and proposes a solution for a very niche group of people, which on one hand is amazing because you can find the perfect solution for you. However, because there's so many choices, you're kind of overwhelmed with comparing them. I'm sure that everyone has felt this with. Maybe this is just me, but I just recently bought a computer, I think 2 months ago, and I was being technical and knowing about computers.
Inundated with the amount and obsessing about it, I bet.
I spent way too much time researching when I kind of intuitively knew what I needed, but I still was going down this, I need to maximize and make sure that I get this exactly right. With that being said, because there's so much to consider outside of just basic intuitive or analytical thinking, do you think that perhaps there's like a total pool of attention or neural capacity that we have, and that's being allotted to decision making and things that aren't necessarily very important, and therefore people are spending less time, going through this critical thinking and reflection and really trying to think about the ideas that they believe in and hold?
Yeah, well, I think one kind of point that you're raising here is that. And this is just kind of making me think about where we are now. Whereas, like, I'm not I'm 52 years old now, so I've seen, I remember sending my first email. I think it was my third year undergrad, and the problem you're facing right now with how we make the decisions with so many choices. I think like that is something that's kind of a more recent thing. The choices we have now are so much, like there's just so much more out there that we're kind of inundated with all this information. Things I think used to be simpler. They definitely, you look way back when you're picking a car or something like that, there weren't many options. Now the options are, it's crazy how many options we have to deal with. So I think there's probably something to what you're saying in that we are now, like, how much of our attentional resources are being spent on navigating so many different choices we're being faced with on a daily basis, which we might not, like, our brains might not have evolved, to deal with this sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Like, you think of the amount of changes. I get fascinated by this stuff. When you think about how our world has changed in the last 100 years, you think about flying, you think about cars, you think about like the speed with which we can now move around the world. And this has all happened over the last, how many years. Our brains throughout, however many millennia have not dealt with this sort of information processing at all. Like we have not experienced it. Like our brains have just have not actually had to have not evolved to actually accommodate all of this information. So there's got to be a cost somewhere. I think there's got to be a cost to something else. And maybe it is putting, diverting our attention to other things.
I feel like we're being overclocked. We're overclocking our brains, our hardware based on the amount of information coming in. So, for example, I graduated last year and I had a full-time job lined up. I was moving to a different country in a different city, and I was very excited. And then when I kind of got here and I settled in, and people, I think a lot of people had the same experience. Once you get out of that educational tract, you are off the rails, not in the sense that I'm like drinking every night or whatever, but in the sense that you had a very linear path to follow and you did it, and now you're free. But now you're kind of like a vehicle in the middle of the desert, and you can go any direction you want. And there's never been more stimulus online. There's never been more ways that have been pitched to you to live your life. You could get a full-time job right away in a top law firm and work your way up and climb the ladder, or you could sell all your possessions and move to Bali for a year or two. And the options are staggering. And I think that does take a toll.
And that's something that I think too as well. Like I think that's something relatively new. Like you think of like education, like even like I'm just thinking about, in our recent history, you think over the last 100 years, like education and all those choices, it's available to everyone now. Well, not everyone, not to say everybody has those opportunities, but way more people. Education used to be kind of reserved for the elite. Like it wasn't everybody that could go to university. It wasn't everybody that could go take jobs in different places. People would kind of grow up in their communities and work at the local, whether it be a factory or whatever that might be, and just kind of follow those paths that their parents, went on. Whereas now we have there's just so much more potential opportunity. And yeah.
Even in today's age, the conscientious mind with YouTube alone can learn almost anything, right? Like if you want to learn how to code, and if you have the time and the bandwidth, holy, you could be up and running in 6 months and get a job if you're committed.
So it's true. It's amazing what is out there. Like now, I know I'm trying to. I used to play guitar years ago, and I was never really that good. And I'm trying to I'm trying to pick it up again and learn. But now there's so much to you want to learn any sort of skill out there. It's like YouTube is it's complete. Like you can find anything.
Taking a bit of a left turn here. One term that I came across when I was doing some research on yourself and your lab, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect, which I've heard of roughly. Can you explain what that is and how does that apply to critical reasoning? Yeah,
so that's basically there's kind of a couple pieces to it. Kind of the one of the more kind of one of the main features of that effect is where basically those that are the least kind of competent in a specific domain are also the ones that are most, or not most competent, but most kind of overcompetent. People that know a lot of stuff are still competent, but those that are actually, there's basically people are kind of across the board relatively comparable in terms of their competence on tasks, but those that are highly incompetent in a specific domain are really miscalibrated.
It's like they don't know what they don't know, and therefore their basis is so unfounded.
Yeah. And so you can imagine how that's kind of problematic, is that there's really a kind of a mismatch between what you know and what you think you know. And it's kind of, it's pretty important, because you think about it, like we use it's basically our metacognitions, what we think we know. We use that to guide our behavior. And we use that to guide when we need to actually learn more information about things. So if our metacognitions are way out of whack, then we're not going to adjust, our behavior appropriately.
It makes me think about the online world, where it feels like everyone has to have an opinion about everything.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if that's because information is so widespread and so accessible now. I wish that I had some stats on this. I think back in the 2010s at some point, I think Microsoft did a study or something like this, where they determined that the average person consumes 77 newspapers worth of information in a single day, which is nuts. So I'm very curious if, because we're exposed to so many ideas, data points, opinions, etc., that people feel like they have enough information to make a judgment or a decision on something, where in reality they don't know how much they don't know.
You're hitting on an extremely important topic, I think, one that we do a little bit of work on in the lab as well too, called the illusion of explanatory depth, which is basically the idea that we basically think we know more about stuff in the world than we do. And one of my graduate students, Ethan Myers, has done a lot of work on this. And basically, what the basic gist of it is, and what I think what probably drives some of this effect, is that, kind of hitting on the point that you just talked about, there's so much information out there in the world that I think it gives us an illusion of what we know, because so much is at our fingertips. So we feel like we know a lot more about things than we actually do. And so, and what the basic, how some of these studies are done, is that basically you ask somebody, how does a helicopter work? Or rate your knowledge of how you think a helicopter works. Something complex like that, even something simple like rate your knowledge of how you think a zipper works. And people in general rate their knowledge on everything across the board quite high. But then you get them to try to explain the phenomena. Okay, now I want you to explain it. And then they go like, oh, I guess I didn't know that. They correct themselves after. But it takes pushing somebody to try to explain something. It takes that to get people to basically better calibrate.
That's so interesting, because I feel like when you're in the laboratory, that is very easy to do. It's just a part of the study. But if you take that medium and you abstract it and say you're on Twitter, where it's people who you don't know who are asking you to confer your understanding, that step of critical thinking might be replaced with just an override of, who's this person calling me out and telling me that I don't know what's going on. It's very, very fascinating. So Ethan, has he considered the impacts and implications of social media on this phenomenon of information overload?
I don't think he might, but we haven't actually incorporated that in our papers. But I think that's a real thing. Because again, that's something again, and I don't know. It'd be interesting, and we can't go back in time. At least I don't think we can. It'd be interesting if some of these phenomena, like Dunning-Kruger, like the illusion of explanatory depth, like all these things. It'd be interesting if they are something that have more of a recent, if they've gotten worse. If it's something that, has always kind of been there, but now it's worse because of the amount of information that people have at their fingertips. That it gives a false, basically because you have all this information out there, does it give you a false sense that you know more than you actually do?
And I suppose that's really challenging to get without something that's very established, like longitudinal data, where you can really track it over
exactly,
time.
yeah. Yeah.
Are there any data sets like that you're aware of that are tracking anything in this domain?
Not that I know of. I don't know of anybody that's looked at this over, a large period of time.
Because I'm in the world of tech, and I was educated as an engineer. I'm so transfixed with how technology impacts society in ways that we can't really predict.
Yeah, well, like you look at all the scares right now with Chat GPT. It's in the news all the time. Like it's like, whoa, we got to put the brakes on this. We have no idea what what this what these latest developments, how they're actually going to alter humanity. It's like that, and I think those questions of how humans and people interact with technology and how that's changed over the years is extremely important.
It's something that I'm the most concerned about, to be honest. It's just the widespread adoption and the unregulation of AI. I was just listening to a talk by Tristan Harris. He's the guy who did The Social Dilemma on Netflix. I'm not sure if you've watched that.
Yeah, I have watched that. Yeah.
Great film for people who are unaware. It's basically doing an assessment and analysis is the word, on all kinds of data points that are longitudinal around the launch of the iPhone in 2007, which is a computer in your pocket, a touchscreen, something that's very salient, it's always on you, and mental health, polarization, all these things.
That's like such an important issue, and that's something I worry about as a father. I have an 11 and a 14-year-old at home, and I see them glued to TikTok, glued to YouTube, glued to all this stuff. And I worry a ton about that. Like that's, I think it's extremely important. And I don't know the data on this at all. I don't know, but I probably hear the same things you do, how, the mental health crisis in our youth and, and wondering the degree to which that is associated with, the increased use of social media. And I don't know, because I don't know any of the data on that, but I have those concerns, and I hear people that know way more about this than me have concerns. So that's enough to give me concern.
Yeah, it's knowing enough to have the concern there, Jonathan.
Exactly. That's what matters. Yeah.
One thing that they talk about in The Social Dilemma and in their most recent talk about AI is phase one, what they call first contact, is social media algorithms trying to limbically hijack people to just keep scrolling, keep consuming, which also could be our pursuit of always looking for more information. What they're now saying for second contact is going to be, and that's what they deemed as the fight for attention, or the race to the bottom of the brainstem, excuse me. What they're deeming phase two with this new generative AI movement, AI really being supercharged, is the race to intimacy, which is really terrifying, because I think, and I wish I had stats in front of me, but loneliness is like at an all-time high. People feel more isolated, less connected, and then you just sprinkle in a super intelligent AI on top of that who knows your every need, and it's
knows, and actually can interact with you in a way that a human, and actually kind of feed you everything you want to hear.
Right.
And I think, and you take that, and I think, and people too, we're, and again, this is not, I'm not an expert on any of this at all, but you take, again, what you see, what we've just gone through too, with the isolation through COVID and all that, people are in this highly vulnerable state. We just spent how much time isolated, and all the mental health issues that's kind of caused. And, you take that and combine that with, this smarter AI, and then, and the increased social media use. It's kind of, it's a terrible combination.
Yeah, I think people are already having a really difficult time with misinformation online. Their feeds are curated for them to keep coming back and consuming more and more, deepening their entrenchment in their beliefs and their tribe, their team. And then when you get to a world where everything can be generated and curated to your whim, it seems like we are headed to a super fragmented and fractured society. And yes, I'm not quite sure what that's gonna look like.
I know, and again, I think it's the dad in me. When I worry so much about my kids right now. I look at them and I worry about them growing up in this world with that. Is it like because it's just changed. It's changed so much in in such a short amount of time. You kind of worry what's it gonna be like in 5 years, 10 years. Yeah. Like it's just, I worry about the isolation. I worry about, like, I see my kids with, scrolling on, they have phones. They probably shouldn't have phones. And I'm embarrassed to say that out loud, being 11 and 14, they have phones. But, I worry a lot about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really tricky, right? Because if they have phones, then as you mentioned, they're glued to the TikTok, YouTube, et cetera, which, I mean, hopefully they're getting some educational stuff out of it. I know TikTok has a lot of fun little like tips and tricks and hacks. One, for example, is when cutting onions. I think if you take a paper towel and you wet it and you stick it on the corner of your cutting board, it'll actually absorb a lot of the onion spray that makes your eyes water and red.
Really?
I didn't know this until my friend's girlfriend told me, and she saw it on TikTok. And I'm like, oh, well, there you go. I guess +1 for TikTok.
Yeah, there we go. That's awesome. I'm going to try that.
Have you guys looked at, so I know that we mentioned earlier about online gurus, Deepak Chopra, people like that. Have you looked at the rise of online gurus and their following? Because I feel like they're almost everywhere. You get people who are going on, they're taking stories of themselves, telling you to manifest your dreams and identity and everything. And
yeah, I haven't myself. Look, I don't know, but it feels like it's on the rise. It also feels like, I think you alluded to before, it feels like the number of people, like it just takes a TikTok account now to become, a guru. You just have to find people that'll listen to you and follow you. So I think it's just the ticket to admission now is that much lower. The price of admission, not the ticket. The price of admission is that much. Like now anybody can actually do it.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting to see how this is all playing out.
Yeah, and I think, and you kind of alluded this before too, as well, is that the amount of like now I think we're just dealing with so much more false information out there. I know with my kids, I have to kind of like they'll tell me things, and I was like, that's not right. That's not true. But somebody will say something online, like that's like or like somebody will post a video of something that it's not real. But the amount of that false information that's out there it just seems like it's just grown astronomically. Well, it's just the access is just that much greater now. Like, so fake news and misinformation and all that kind of stuff, like that's nothing new. It's been going on, for forever, but it's just the social media has made the spread of it that much more problematic, because now it's so easy to put it out there.
Right. The cost of communication is zero. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Prior to that, if you were, say, in a smaller, intimate town where you didn't have, IT communications, then you had to risk the chance that if you were to spread misinformation, you would be called out for that and your reputation would be damaged and all this stuff. And now you can get online and you can, use Chat GPT and generate, tens or hundreds of articles and just put them out and, game the search engine optimization and try to drive traffic. And it's very interesting. I think, and I forget his name right now. He wrote Deep Work, Cal Newport. He wrote, I think online, and said the cost for an email should be raised from $0 to something like a fifth of a cent or 5 cents or something like that. And just trying to align the incentive of communication with the importance of it is.
Yeah, and the other that kind of reminds me of another issue. It's kind of reminds me of one of the student I mentioned before that came up with the bullshit stuff, Gordon Pennycook's work, where he basically he's looked at as well at people like just sharing, fake news stories, and it's like people will share without putting any sort of thought into it whatsoever. And they can be even like, and so what he's kind of done some really important work in looking at like how like interventions, like just basically giving an accuracy nudge, having people to kind of at least slow down a little bit to think about the accuracy of that post before you share it, can reduce the amount of sharing that, false information. But that's like the problem, like you said, like there's no cost right now. You get that, like, just people look at things, they'll just share things broadly, and there's no cost to that.
So what does that intervention look like? Is that just something like when you go to retweet something or share something on Facebook, are you prompted with?
So he did it with, yes. So he did it on Twitter, I believe. And it's just basically I can't think of what the actual word of the prompt was, but it's basically just asking people to rate the accuracy of this information before you actually go out and sharing it. And it reduces it. It actually has it reduces one's likelihood of sharing misinformation online.
It's very interesting. I wonder if you could tie that to how long you're looking at something. So, for example, if you're on your phone, if you're scrolling and you come across something, how long should you be paused to analyze that before you're allowed to share it in a way?
Right. Yeah.
Not that I think that the cat may be out of the bag at this point, but perhaps regulations or something can be put in place where
just put a delay. It's like that same thing, like sometimes you should like, take the time and sleep on something before you reply to a difficult email or something, and because you'll come to it with fresher eyes in the morning. It's, you can imagine like something that just enforcing some sort of pause. That's a good idea. I think it actually is something that's worth looking at, because just enforcing that pause, because the idea is that it forces you to reflect a little bit, and that enough to stop you from, making you think it's like, maybe I shouldn't share this.
That makes me really think about the pandemic, and I'm sure different places experienced this to different degrees, but I know in Canada we were relatively what's the term? I was going to say complacent, but that's exactly the opposite. We were relatively, I feel like, accepting of a lot of the restrictions. And then over time, there was this growing movement of rebellion.
Yep,
I saw that you had looked at some of the pandemic compliance and things like that. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
Okay, yeah. Just I was thinking about it. Wait a minute. Yes, we did do that. We're basically, like we were kind of looking at one's just willingness to adhere to recommendations. And it's it's something that you're totally hitting the nail on the head there. It's something that I think, well, there's one thing there's huge individual differences on, but it's another thing that actually changed throughout time as well too, is that people, I think by the time I forget the name, Omicron, I think was one of the last, I think by the time that one, people were just, I think they had a lot of fatigue of, the restrictions, and we're just basically kind of no longer like, it's like, okay, this is, enough is enough. And I was actually just talking with a colleague the other day about this, and like if another one comes along, I think people will be much less willing to accept any sort of restrictions that are put in place. Yeah,
I mean, my personal anecdote is I think by the time that one rolled around, I think I was near graduation. I think it was in my last term of my last year. And I'm like, fuck, like, am I going to have to be online for the final term?
I know. It created, like, I know just from like teaching as well too. I I was telling this to a student the other day. It was really it was hard for me to teach after the pandemic because you don't realize when you're teaching all the time, you get the nerves. You kind of you're always nervous a bit. Well, not everybody, but I always am a little bit nervous, which is good. But man, when I came, it was because I was anxious. I hadn't been around other people in a long time. Then all of a sudden being in front of a classroom again, it was it was hard. I had a really hard time with just, standing in front of a classroom again. And it just, I felt my confidence was gone. It was a much more difficult environment.
Yeah.
It was just all of a sudden just being around people again. It was I'm not used to this. I want to go back into my basement again and just, into my basement office where I, was by myself and safe. It was hard. Yeah.
Totally.
And students, I think students really had a, even though there's a lot of appetite to come back, a lot of excitement about coming back, it was still it was a hard, a lot of students hadn't taken a in-person test in a couple of years. And then all of a sudden, we're, having to do tests in person again. And yeah, that was yeah.
One thing that I've been trying to be a lot more conscientious of is to not cast judgment. So even, for example, and maybe that sounds horrible in this context, but even today, I was out running yesterday morning, and just Austin has a beautiful trail around downtown, around Ladybird Lake. It's the Colorado River. And you do see a few people who are still outside wearing masks. And my gut reaction is, oh man, this is we're kind of done with this. But then I have to stop myself and slow down and say, okay, well, maybe they're a primary care for their parent who's very old and ill. Yeah. So I think just trying to have more empathy for people who belong to these different groups, these imaginary groups that you've made up in your mind. And then to the point that we've been talking about is with this movement of generative AI with social media, everyone has a different set of information. And if you had their exact set of information, you would probably believe the exact same things that they do.
Everybody is 100%, and everybody's in completely different situations. Everybody has different comfort zones around safety. And yeah, and people, and I think that's that we can all basically, develop a bit more of that
empathy, kindness,
empathy, that really you never know what that person has gone through. You have to, without walking a mile in their shoes kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. I think those are probably some of the most important words to live by, I think.
And it's hard. It takes practice. But this kind of brings me to the next little section that I want to explore. And we talked a lot about this pseudo-profound bullshit. We've talked a lot about people making patterns out of nothing and believing things that they haven't really thought through critically. And as we pointed out, you can't do that with everything. So with all this information, with all the research that's come out of your lab by yourself and your students, how can we use this to better arm ourselves to be more critical thinking, or to not fall for these thought patterns or these fallacies? Do you have any recommendations or protocols?
Unfortunately, that's one of the hardest things to do. Basically, how to debias. That is one of, we've tried a lot of stuff over the years to try to debias, and with very little success. I think just basic education and there's example, there's been a fair amount of work because of all the misinformation out there in the world right now. That's kind of been a very active area of research on how to best arm people to better, be better consumers of information. And, I mentioned, my former student, Gordon Pennycook, has done the accuracy nudges. There's other labs as well, too, that have looked at, which might be of interest to you in the technology world, is gamified solutions as well, too. So giving people, app app games that actually teach people how to be better critical consumers of information. Basically teaching people how easy it is to develop misleading information online. Like how to basically teaching people how, what sorts of things people fall for, like basically an example of, emotional content. So something that's more emotionally evocative, you're going to more likely resonate with you, and you're going to be more likely to potentially fall for it. While informing people about that is helpful. One thing that I think is, and I just kind of learned this. I was attending last week a conference here on campus on the weaponization of disinformation, which is a really interesting conference. And one of the things I learned there is there are certain places around the world, like Finland was one of them, where they actually have, as part of their educational curriculum, teaching about misleading, how to be a better critical consumer of information, teaching them about misinformation online. They start this with kids, in elementary school, and it's integrated within all the curriculum, which we don't do here in Canada, which I think, which we need to start doing. It's just kind of infusing this in our children's education, so that you actually are brought up. It's part ingrained in you when you're going to school, that this is, that not everything, because I see with my kids, they think everything is real. I think it was this, it's kind of, and there's this, I think it was Gilbert at Harvard who basically kind of who talked about this, how we have this basic natural tendency, like our default is to believe.
Yep.
If we're to understand something, we first have to assume it to be true. So we have this default basically to believe something, and it takes effort to unbelieve it.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, it's almost like society has to function on that base premise.
It's like you have to kind of like interact. Like when I'm talking with you right now, I have to kind of, my default assumption is you're being truthful with me. And that's like, you kind of have to have that. But that default assumption kind of means that we're vulnerable to other information. And so it's kind of a sad state of affairs that we're in when you think about it. But we do need to start with our kids and basically instruct, okay, the world, not everything you see is real. Think critically about everything you see and hear. But at the same time, it's a slippery slope, because you don't want to just make highly critical people that question everything. It's like 2 + 2 still equals 4. There's certain, but it's being able to kind of discern what is truthful and what is not.
Yeah, my roommate and I were actually talking about this last night. Is just, and I think that the context again was this AI revolution that we're going to go under, but the concept was you need to be able to establish a ground truth, because if you guys don't even believe the same information sets, you can't have a meaningful conversation or a discussion. So that, I think that you raise a very, very good point there. And education, I think, is one of the most important things, and it's so challenging because things are moving so quickly. Technology is advancing at a rate that is it's so breakneck. If you're not tapped into the tech scene, then you might miss something. It's hard to scale education with technology, but it's one of the most important challenges that we need to face.
But just pushing general critical thinking skills at a very young age and teaching them about misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's something that could be like a constant that could hopefully, and again, I don't know any research on this whatsoever, that hopefully can help, guard against, at least to some degree, susceptibility to this information.
Is there any work that's coming out of your lab in particular that you are exceptionally excited about or looking forward to? Anything top of mind that gets you up in the morning and gets excited to get to your sweet
A
office?
lot of it is, like, I'm extremely lucky. I have my research program has always been driven by my students, and I say that like they basically drive where things are going. I think that the work that we've been talking about on illusion of explanatory depth is really cool stuff, and I think it's important because it's one of the it's and I'm just kind of picking this one example. It's one of the areas that has been shown to actually have a general debiasing effect, like just getting people to slow down, explain something, helps people kind of better calibrate. I think anything we can do to help better calibrate what our our knowledge is, and basically what we think our knowledge is going to be helpful. We're also just started doing work. One of my new master students, Hamza, is just starting to do work on what's called algorithm aversion as well too. Just this basic idea about how humans have a general tendency to mistrust algorithms, which might be a good thing. But and you look at the kind of examples out there of autonomous cars. If an accident happens with a Tesla, it's big news. But humans get in accidents all the time. And so he's been just starting to do some research on what it is about people's, reluctance to let machines do decisions for us. What is it about that why is it that we have this general tendency, and trying to understand that, which I think is a really important area given how technology and our reliance on technology to make decisions is increasing.
Jonathan Fugelsang, ladies and gentlemen. Jonathan, if people want to follow your work, follow you, where can they go? Where can they hear more about these fascinating studies and research that's coming out of your lab?
I would and don't look at my lab website because I haven't updated that in a while. But if you just search my name on Google, it'll take you to the university website, and there we pretty much have a lot of recent papers that we're working on, at least listed there.
Jonathan, thank you so much for your time. This was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Jack. I really, really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for the opportunity.